They buried her without a prayer and left her newborn son crying on the dirt beside her grave. No one dared to hold him, until a silent Apache rode in from the canyon, took the child without a word, and vanished. 20 years later, that same boy returned with a bow, a fire, and a truth that would burn through everything the town thought it buried. You think you know how this ends, but you don't. They buried her under a crooked cottonwood, the kind that split fences and drew lightning. No headstone, just a plank of wood with her name carved too shallow to last. Clara May. The woman they never really saw while she was alive, and now pretended not to remember in death. It was just past noon, sun hanging high, beating down on the dry earth behind the chapel in Flagstaff, Arizona. A small town too proud of its silence, too scared of its reflection. No hymns were sung. No prayers meant anything. The preacher read his lines like he was late for lunch. He said her name like it was just another page to turn, another obligation to bury. No one wore black, no one brought flowers, no one cried. But the baby did. He cried like he was born to scream against the world. Just days old, his fists balled tight, his voice raw with need and grief, and something no one there could name. Wrapped in a worn blue shawl, he lay at the edge of the grave, not in anyone's arms but on the dirt, beside the hole that had taken his mother. His skin, sun-warmed and earth-colored, unsettled the town more than his tears ever could. They all saw him, and they all looked away. There was no father to claim him, no kin willing to hold him. Clara's older sister, Martha, stood with her arms folded and her mouth pinched like she'd swallowed the truth and it had soured. She didn't move when the baby wailed, didn't blink when he choked on his own sobs. Her stillness was louder than any sermon. They said Clara never spoke of the man, that she worked in the chapel kitchen, kept her head down, and carried her belly like it was a burden God gave her and no one else would carry. There were whispers, of course, the kind that grew legs and teeth. Some said the father was a drifter. Others swore it was a soldier passing through. One woman muttered it was one of the Apache. But no one said his name. Maybe because they didn't know it. Maybe because they didn't want to. The child cried louder, almost as if calling for something more ancient than pity. Still, no one moved. Not even the preacher, who'd stepped back now, holding his Bible like it might protect him from whatever curse the child carried. And then, a sound. Hoofbeats. Slow. Heavy. Final. They came from the ridge behind the cemetery, where the land rose like a question the town never wanted to answer. A figure appeared, silhouetted against the burning sky. Tall, still, wrapped in soft hide, his hair braided long, his face unreadable. He rode alone. No one spoke. No one had to. They knew what he was, Apache. He reached the gate and dismounted. His boots hit the ground like thunder without sound. He didn't look at anyone, just walked, straight through the gap in the crowd that opened like a wound. His presence sliced through the air, not because he demanded it, but because something in him required it. A silence older than judgment. A promise older than law. He walked to the grave, then to the baby. He knelt. Gently. Like the earth might shatter beneath him. His hand, scarred, strong, hovered near the child's face, not touching, just letting the warmth of his palm settle the way a fire settles a storm. The crying stopped. Just like that. As if the boy had been waiting for this moment. This man, his whole life. Even if that life had only just begun. The man spoke. Not to the people, not to the preacher, to the baby, to the wind. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. He reached into a leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a small woven charm, cedar, sinew, and something else invisible. Memory, maybe. He placed it over the boy's heart like a seal. Then, without asking, without permission, he lifted the child, shawl and all, into his arms. Still, no one spoke. Not even Martha. The man turned, holding the baby against his chest. His eyes scanned the crowd for a moment, not in accusation but in farewell. And as he mounted his horse, he looked toward the grave one last time and said, in perfect, clear English, "His name is Kael." I promised. Then he rode, down the ridge, through the dust, into the horizon, and he never looked back. The wind returned to the graveyard like a sigh that had been holding too long. The preacher cleared his throat. Martha stared at the dirt. The townsfolk shifted, but still, not one moved toward where the baby had been just moments before. But something had shifted. The town didn't know what they had just seen. But years later, when fire came, when truth came, when love came back like thunder in the bones, they would remember this day. The blue shawl, the Apache, the name Kael, and they would wonder, what would have happened if they had stepped forward first? But they hadn't. He did. The canyon did not greet them. It simply accepted their presence, the way stone accepts wind, slow, silent, unbending. When Tomas Nokose rode into Whispering Canyon with the baby pressed to his chest, there was no ceremony, no fanfare. Just the soft hush of cedar trees and the low murmur of the San Juan River winding through ancient stone. Kael didn't remember his first night there, but Tomas never forgot it. The boy barely stirred as he laid him beside the fire, nestled in the cradle of blankets woven from river grass and hide. The same blue shawl from the grave wrapped around him like a second skin, still clinging to the scent of flower and firewood. Tomas had whispered the name once more before sleep took them both. Kael. A name forged in promise. A name never given but entrusted. In the days that followed, Tomas built not just a home, but a rhythm. He rose before dawn, carried Kael strapped across his chest, and moved through the canyon with the patience of someone who had long ago learned that the world did not owe him speed. He taught Kael by doing, not through words, but through presence. He hunted without anger, gathered with gratitude, tracked by listening to the land rather than dominating it. And Kael, even as a toddler, absorbed everything like thirsty soil. At first, the people of the tribe watched from a distance. Tomas had long been known as the quiet one, the man who kept to the outer shadows of camp, who spoke only when the wind demanded witness. They had accepted him because he belonged to them by history. But the boy, the child of a settler woman buried without mourning, that was something else entirely. Whispers followed Tomas wherever he brought Kael, to the water, to the fire circle, even to the old stone where prayers were left. Why raise a child who will never be one of us? Some asked. Why give space to a boy born of silence? Others said. But Tomas never answered. He didn't need to, because Kael grew. And as he grew, he did not demand to belong. He simply did. By age 7, Kael could track rabbit prints through thick brush and never break a twig. At 9, he could string a bow faster than boys 3 years older. He moved like the river, never loud, but always forward. His eyes were sharp and steady, his hands careful. The elders began to notice, then to nod, then finally to accept. It was not just what Kael could do, it was how he did it. He shared what he caught, even when his belly grumbled. He mended what he broke. He never bragged, never sought approval. He walked with humility, not because he had been taught it, but because it had been woven into his life from the moment Tomas picked him up from the edge of a grave. Still, Kael had questions. At night, when the canyon turned silver beneath the stars, he would lie beside the fire and whisper to Tomas, "What was she like?" Sometimes, Thomas answered. She smelled like cinnamon and ash, he once said, and she sang to the river even when it didn't answer. Why did she leave me? Thomas didn't lie. She didn't. The world did. Those answers carried Kael for a while, but silence has its own hunger, and the older he got, the more he felt it gnawing. Not resentment, no, but a kind of longing, buried deep and heavy, the way roots carry thirst even after rain. At 13, Thomas gave Kael a carved bow of juniper, sleek and strong, etched with marks only they understood. Along with it, a braided leather cord holding the cedar charm Thomas had placed on his chest the day they met. It had aged with him, cracked in places, darkened by time, but still whole. This is not a weapon, Thomas said as he handed it to him. It's a question. Use it only when you have your answer. From that day, Kael trained harder. Not to fight, but to understand. Every hunt was a lesson. Every arrow loosed was a thought made real. He learned that the smallest sound could mean life or death, not just for prey, but for the one holding the bow. He learned to walk through snow without leaving prints. He learned to climb without disturbing the birds. And slowly, his presence began to change the air around him. The other young hunters followed his lead. The elders asked for his input. The head woman, Sally, who had once said the boy was born in silence, began calling him Kael of the listening eyes. But even as he was being embraced, Kael kept part of himself apart. There was a ridge above the canyon where he often climbed alone, a narrow overlook where the wind hit sharp, and the sky opened wide enough to hold a mother's ghost. There, he would whisper to the wind, like Thomas had once whispered to him, "I remember you." At 15, Kael began taking longer trips beyond the canyon, hunting in deeper forests, trading at river crossings. And it was during one of these trips that he saw the town for the first time in years. Flagstaff. He didn't go in, not yet. He stood at the edge, beneath the same crooked cottonwood, watching as people bustled in and out of shops, laughed without guilt, prayed without grief. He wondered if they ever thought of her. He wondered if they remembered the blue shawl. He turned and left, but the seed had been planted. The silence had shifted. Back in the canyon, he told Thomas what he had seen. The older man nodded, not surprised. "The past doesn't sleep," he said. "It waits." Kael didn't respond. But that night, he took the cedar charm from his neck and held it to his chest for a long time before sleep. The world had once turned its back on him. But Kael was growing into the kind of man who would not return the favor, not yet, but someday. And when that day came, he would carry more than skill and silence. He would carry fire. The wind smelled like flower and pine when Kael saw her for the first time. He'd come into town not as a boy with a chip on his shoulder, but as a man with eyes sharp as the hills and a silence too deep to explain. It had been years since he last stepped within sight of Flagstaff, but he knew its bones well. The chapel with the leaning bell tower, the bakery that once served cinnamon bread on Sundays, the crooked cottonwood behind the graveyard. Nothing had changed. Not the way the townspeople stole glances when they thought he wasn't looking. Not the way conversations quieted when he passed. But she was new. Her name was Elsie Monroe, though he wouldn't learn that for a few days more. The first time he saw her, she was standing behind the bakery counter, brushing flour from her forearms, laughing at something an old man had said. Her hair was pinned up, loose strands curling near her cheekbones. She smiled, like the sun didn't have to fight so hard in that town. Her presence was so easy it didn't seem possible, not in a place like that. Kael stood in the shade across the street, a satchel of furs over his shoulder, watching her hands move. They were strong, purposeful, stained by dough and heat, yet delicate, like they'd never known cruelty. When she looked up and met his gaze through the window, something paused inside him. Not like fear, more like recognition, as if the canyon had whispered her name years ago and he'd only now heard it again in flesh. He came back the next day under the guise of trade. Butter, salt, a few bundles of juniper bark. She served him a small loaf, crust golden, soft inside, still warm. "No charge," she said. "You look like someone who appreciates good bread." He didn't argue, just nodded, took the bread, and left. It became a rhythm. He'd return once a week, sometimes with pelts, sometimes with herbs, sometimes with nothing. They'd talk more each time, first about ingredients, then weather, then wild herbs, then stories. Kael didn't offer much at first, but Elsie didn't mind silence. She filled it with her own words, her own world. She spoke of dreams she'd never spoken aloud, leaving town someday, opening her own shop somewhere else, maybe near a river, where she could bake and read and never have to watch her words around people who didn't know how to listen. She didn't ask about his past, not once. And for that, he found himself staying longer. He taught her how to tell real juniper berries from bitter ones. She showed him how to knead dough so it sang in the oven. He fixed the broken latch on her back door. She packed him bundles of sweetbread for his return trips. One day, he gave her a small carved token, cedar and antler, shaped like a sprouting seed. She turned it in her fingers like it was gold. She never asked what it meant. Kael never told her it was the same symbol carved into his bow, that it was the mark Thomas used when writing the name Kael in his own quiet ledger, out of reach of any town's record. Weeks passed. Spring came early. The town thawed but never softened. Whispers still clung like dust, especially when Kael walked beside Elsie to the well or through the market. No one stopped them. But no one welcomed them either. It didn't matter, not to him. Not when Elsie would brush a strand of hair behind her ear and lean in close to ask, "What does the sky feel like when you sleep under it?" Not when she touched his hand and didn't flinch. But the silence couldn't hold forever. One morning, while Kael waited near the bakery's back door, an old woman stepped out and glared. "You'd do well to stay where you belong," she hissed. "This town doesn't forget what came crawling out of a grave." Kael didn't answer, just turned and walked away. But Elsie saw it from the window. She saw his jaw tighten, saw the way his hands curled at his sides. That evening, when he returned, she handed him a cloth, bundle without a word. Inside was a small book, leather-bound, faded, the edges worn. He opened it carefully. It was her recipe journal. Inside, every page was hers, her handwriting, her symbols, her stories. On the last page, she had written, "If you go where I can't follow yet, take this. So you remember something sweet came from this place, too." Kael didn't speak. He couldn't. That night, he climbed the ridge behind the town, the same one where the cottonwoods still stood, the same place where Thomas had once ridden down with a baby, wrapped in a blue shawl, and no one brave enough to lift him. Kael sat beneath that tree, the book on his lap, and watched the lights flicker in the distance. He thought of Thomas, of Clara, of the silence that had followed him from birth, and the voice of a woman who had never asked him to explain himself. For the first time in years he cried, not out of pain, but out of recognition. Love had found him, not in a chapel, not in a name, but in a girl who kneaded flour like it was a form of prayer, and who offered him her story like it was bread meant to be shared. He didn't know yet how the truth would unfold. That fire was coming. That silence would be broken. That he would have to choose between the canyon that raised him and the town that tried to bury him. But sitting there, beneath the sky, holding her words in his hands, Kael made a vow. He would not run from either world. He would walk into both, and he would do so not with shame, but with fire. The fire started where no one was watching. A ridge north of town, bone-dry and choked with underbrush, struck by lightning in the hours before dawn. No one heard the strike, but by mid-morning, smoke began to whisper across the hills, and by noon it wasn't whispering anymore. Kael was coming down the trail from Whispering Canyon when he smelled it. Burnt air, the crisp crackle of distant trees folding in on themselves. The smoke curled in the sky like a signal only he could read. Something ancient stirred in his bones. Instinct. He pushed his horse harder. By the time he reached the edge of Flagstaff, chaos had already taken hold. Flames licked across rooftops, smoke poured from the back of the church, and the townspeople, so composed in their judgment, so still in their silence, now scrambled like broken lines of scripture in a windstorm. Kael didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for orders, and he didn't ask for permission. He dismounted and ran straight into the heart of it. At the town square, the well had run dry. Buckets clattered uselessly against stone. A child cried out from inside the smithy, where fire danced along the eaves. Without breaking stride, Kael scaled the wall, smashed the window, and lifted the boy out with arms that had hauled elk through canyons. He handed the child off, then vanished again into the smoke. Someone called his name, but not with fear, with hope. He found Sheriff Jensen near the stable, trying to calm panicked horses that nearly trampled him. Kael stepped in, grabbed the lead rope, pressed a palm to the horse's flank, whispered something low and ancient. The beast calmed. Jensen looked at him like he was seeing more than a man. Kael didn't wait for thanks. He ran toward the bakery. The roof had begun to cave. Flames twisted along the rafters like serpents. He kicked in the door and found Elsie inside, sheets of dough still on the counter, her arms wrapped around her recipe book, refusing to leave it. He didn't speak, just grabbed her, wrapped her in a wet blanket from the barrel, and pulled her through the back as the ceiling collapsed behind them. Outside, she coughed, covered in ash, but alive. He dropped to his knees beside her, checked her pulse, and only then let himself breathe. Their eyes met, and she said, voice cracked, "I knew you'd come." The words did something to him that the fire couldn't reach. The townsfolk gathered at the edge of the field where the fire now threatened the chapel and the schoolhouse. Mothers held children. Old men clutched rifles that wouldn't stop flame. People looked to the sheriff, who looked to Kael. He stepped forward. "Dig a trench," he said. "Here to there. Fast. Wet the blankets. Build a barrier from the wagons. If it jumps this line, we lose everything." No one questioned him. They followed. Kael moved like someone born for that moment. He knew how fire fed, how it shifted with the wind, how it devoured fear. He positioned people by skill, putting the strongest with the axes, the fastest with the buckets, the oldest in charge of calming the horses and guarding the children. He had seen this kind of fire in the canyon, had listened to Tomas explain how flame was not evil, it was impatient, and this time it would wait. Hours passed, the line held, ash rained from the sky like memory, but slowly the fire gave up. The wind shifted west. Embers died in the trenches. The last of the smoke curled into the orange twilight and disappeared. Silence returned. Not the silence of judgment, but the kind that follows grace. Kael stood covered in soot, shoulders streaked with burns, fingers blistered, but he was whole. Elsie walked to him, pressed a damp cloth to his arm. "You didn't just save the town," she whispered. "You saved the truth." He looked past her, toward the chapel, toward the ridge behind it, toward the grave of a woman buried in shame, and a town that never expected to be grateful to her son. That night, as people picked through the rubble, a quiet reverence fell over Flagstaff. Not a celebration, there was too much loss for that, but something deeper, humility, recognition. They watched Kael, not like a stranger, not like a story someone else told, but like a man who had stood in fire for them. In the corner of the field, Sheriff Jensen opened a parcel he'd brought with him. Inside were seeds. Clara's seeds. He'd found them in the records drawer weeks earlier, an old envelope marked in her handwriting. Sweet grain, good for light bread. For spring. He walked to Kael, placed them in his hand. She ordered these, he said, before she... He didn't finish. Kael nodded. I know. Elsie reached out, touched the envelope too. Let's plant them, she said. For her, for what comes next. And they did. They dug into the fire-blackened earth with blistered hands, and they planted the seeds she'd chosen for a future no one had let her live to see. The town watched, and no one stopped them. The fire had taken much, but it had given something back too, something that could never be burned. Morning arrived with the hush of something sacred. The air was heavy with dew and ash, the sky still wearing the bruises of fire from the night before. But beneath the ruin and soot, something had shifted. It wasn't just that the flames were gone, it was that the silence that had defined Flagstaff for so long had finally broken open. And in its place, truth began to bloom. Kael stood at the edge of the graveyard, where the crooked cottonwood still leaned like a sentinel. His hands, rough with soot and splinters, held a small pouch of seeds, Clara May's seeds, wrapped in her handwriting, smudged from fire, still legible. Sweet grain for spring. They'd been planted now, scattered with quiet reverence beneath the blackened soil behind the chapel. Not as tribute, but as return. A future planted where once there was only shame. He was not alone. Sheriff Jensen arrived first, carrying something under his arm. An old town ledger, its leather cover weathered, the edges flaked with time. He approached Kael without a badge today, just a man carrying a memory. He opened the book to the page once left blank, and then, with careful fingers, he wrote, Name, Kael mother, Clara May. Father, unknown to town. Raised by Thomas Nokose, Apache, guardian by choice, keeper of a promise. Jensen didn't look up as he wrote the last line. Seen last in the arms of a man who did not speak, but who did not have to. Kael watched him finish. He didn't speak either. The wind moved through the grass like a soft exhale. The cottonwood creaked. A name, once denied, now rested in ink. Not to validate Kael's existence, but to honor the woman who bore it in silence and the man who carried it forward. Later that afternoon, Elsie returned to the chapel steps carrying something wrapped in cloth. She unfolded it carefully, Clara's recipe book, the one Kael had once held beneath stars and sorrow. She opened it to the back page where Clara had written, If the wind carries him, let him know I chose him. Even when I could not speak it, even when no one would believe it. His name is Kael, and he was always meant to survive me. Elsie placed the book at the chapel door, pinned beneath a single cedar sprig and one of Kael's carved charms, cedar, sinew, shaped like fire, held in a hand. No one moved to take it down, not even the preacher. Instead, by evening, someone had placed a loaf of almond bread beside it. Then another, and a note. She mattered. Kael didn't stay to read them. He returned to Whispering Canyon, to the land that had raised him when the world would not. But the canyon, too, had changed. The children no longer watched him from a distance. They followed him on hunts, listened when he spoke, asked questions about things beyond their ridge. Tomas, older now, slower in his steps, watched with quiet satisfaction as Kael taught the skills he had once learned in silence. Tracking, bow work, listening to the earth. But also trust, balance, the courage to carry grief without letting it harden into rage. Elsie came often now, sometimes to learn, sometimes just to be near. They built a garden together, planted with Clara's seeds, and each year, when the bread came from that field, they baked the first loaf without salt, only sweet, because grief, once tasted fully, didn't need bitterness to be remembered. One day, while Kael was mending a fence post near the canyon edge, a rider approached. It was Sheriff Jensen again, but he wasn't there on business. He dismounted with a careful look and handed Kael a small object wrapped in red cloth. "It's from the townspeople," he said, "from all of us, for the school you're building." Kael unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a carved sign, burned into oak with practiced hands. It read, Clara's Grove, a place for children of two worlds to learn one truth. We are more than where we begin. Kael said nothing, just nodded, and for Jensen that was enough. By the end of that summer the school had opened, small, simple, roofed in bark and cloth, but alive with sound, laughter, questions, language spoken in Apache and English. Children from the town and the canyon learning together, kneading bread, carving arrows, reading Clara's old herbal notes like scripture. Kael stood at the door each morning, greeting each child with a look that said, "You are seen, you are held, you are enough." He never used a title, not teacher, not sheriff, not preacher. He was simply Kael, the one who had once been left beside a grave, and who had returned with fire, not to destroy, but to illuminate. Years passed. Trees grew where fire had once consumed everything. The almond grove behind the chapel bloomed each spring. A blue shawl, long since faded, hung from the cottonwood like a flag of memory. No longer sorrowful. Now a banner of what had survived. And every spring, when the first loaf came from Clara's Grove, Elsie would walk it to the chapel, place it beside her mother's recipe book, and light a single candle. Kael never watched. He didn't need to. The canyon, the town, and the fire between them had become one story. Not about vengeance or shame, but about return. About how love, when carried through silence and flame, doesn't just survive. It changes everything. Final reflection. Kael, the son of silence. There are stories that flicker like sparks, brief, bright, forgotten by morning. Then there are stories like Kael's. Stories that burn slow, smolder deep, and etch themselves into memory not because of how loud they shout, but because of how quietly they endure. Kael was never supposed to survive. Not in a town like Flagstaff. Not in a world like the one that buried his mother with no prayer worth meaning, and left him crying in the dirt like a secret no one wanted to name. From the moment Clara May took her last breath, and her child's first wail was met with silence, Kael's story became a quiet rebellion against erasure. He was never given a beginning that promised a future. And yet, somehow he carved one out of ash, cedar, and the stillness of a canyon that taught him how to listen before speaking. Raised by Tomas Nokose, a man who spoke more with action than words, Kael learned early that the world didn't owe him understanding, but that didn't mean he couldn't offer it to others. Through each quiet sunrise in Whispering Canyon, through each lesson in the wilderness, how to hunt with respect, how to walk without fear, how to listen to the earth. Kael was not just becoming a man, he was becoming a keeper of two worlds. He did not hate the town that had rejected him. He could have, many would have. But instead, he grew into his silence, not as a shield, but as a tool. He let the canyon refine him. He let love find him, not in grand gestures but in flower-dusted smiles and almond-sweet moments with Elsie Monroe, the baker's daughter who looked at him and didn't flinch. She didn't demand his past. She offered him a place in her future. And yet, even love wasn't enough to erase what had been done. Healing, in Kael's story, was never about forgetting. It was about facing. When fire came roaring through the hills and threatened the very town that once turned its back on him, Kael didn't hesitate. He didn't ask whether they deserved his help. He didn't demand a name or a place or a thank you. He acted. And in doing so, he changed everything. That single day, when he rode into flame, saved children, calmed horses, held Elsie as her bakery burned, and led strangers to safety, was not just a turning point for Flagstaff. It was a reckoning, a long overdue one. Because sometimes it takes fire to reveal who will run, who will hide, and who will stand in the heat and refuse to let the world burn. Kael stood. And when the smoke cleared, the people saw not just the man who had saved them, but the child they had once left behind. They saw Clara's eyes in his face. They saw Thomas's steadiness in his walk. They saw their shame in his grace. And still, Kael did not seek revenge. He sought truth. He returned to the grave of a mother never honored and planted seeds in the soil where sorrow had once been sown. He built a school where children could learn both their heritage and their hope. He opened a space for two worlds to meet without fear. And he became something Flagstaff never thought it could deserve: its healer. Not because he forgave them in words, but because he built something better in their silence. What do we learn from Kael's story? We learn that identity is not something the world gives us. It's something we grow, seed by seed, choice by choice. Kael was denied a name, a history, and a place, but he did not let that define the boundaries of his life. He created his own roots in the ground others had called cursed. We learn that love is not always loud, it's not always obvious. Sometimes it comes in the form of a man who says little but carries a child from a grave without asking for permission. Sometimes it's in the hands of a girl who bakes with memory and touches without judgment. Love, in its quietest forms, is often the strongest. We learn that legacy isn't just about blood. Thomas didn't share Kael's ancestry, but he gave him something more lasting: identity, dignity, purpose. In a world obsessed with lineage and labels, this story reminds us that family is often forged by choice, not chance. And perhaps most importantly, we learn that silence can either be a prison or a promise. For Flagstaff, silence was once a way to avoid truth. For Kael, silence became a tool to carry it. In that contrast, we find the heartbeat of this entire tale. So, what can we carry from Kael's journey into our own lives today? In a world that often seeks to categorize us, dismiss us, erase our stories when they're inconvenient, Kael's life reminds us to hold fast to our truth, even when no one listens. Especially then. In a time when division thrives and empathy feels scarce, his example shows us that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks into the fire with open hands and builds something where others only saw ruin. And in our everyday choices, how we speak, how we forgive, how we show up for others, we are reminded that we are the bridge between what we inherit and what we leave behind. You don't have to be born into the right name to live a story that matters. You just have to carry the right kind of fire. And Kael, he carried it well. Thank you for taking this journey with us, through silence, through smoke, through healing. If this story moved you, if Kael's legacy touched something in you, we invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to the channel because there are more stories to tell. Stories of the forgotten, the resilient, the brave. Stories like Kael's. And you? You're part of that now. Let's keep remembering, together.